What's up everybody, Gary Simon here. So today I've created a mashup video that includes 36 different redesigns that are part of my previous rapid redesign series. So if you watch enough of these, it's going to help you avoid common pitfalls when you try to design UIs. All right, so make sure to subscribe and let's get started. Our first entry here is a hero section which has several issues with white space, alignment, and contrast. So let's see if we can give this thing an improvement. So they had a pretty solid headline. It's large enough and it's nice and bold. And one thing I decided to do pretty quickly was to create a two-column layout, as their current approach contained quite a bit of rows of data all being stacked on top of each other. Now, one area that they got wrong was their call to action buttons. There is simply not enough contrast based on the colors chosen. And based on this background color, I decided to use white as that would provide most of the contrast. Now for the second column, I decided to bring focus to the countdown and stack the 4 time blocks in rows to fill up that column appropriately. The second entry features a contact form, and the two issues this design suffers from the most are typography and contrast. So let's get started. So the typography overall is suffering a bit due to the tracking or the letter spacing that's occurring. They've used extended letter spacing in such a way that really throws off the flow of the design. Now, when in doubt, just stick to the default tracking. As for their text fields, there's simply not enough contrast based on the input background and the background that it's sitting on. You need to use either a high contrast border or ensure that the background itself has a high enough contrast in comparison to the background it's sitting on. And you also need to ensure that the text inside of the input field also contrasts enough. And this is true for both placeholder values and also the real typed in values as well. Now, right here, I decided to experiment with a little bit of a graphic design, creating an arrow that points from the left column where the contact label is to the right column where the actual form is. Now, this is of course completely unnecessary, but I figured I'd have some fun. Now this third and final design has quite a few issues as it pertains to alignment, white space, and overall composition. I spent a lot of time on this one, so let's see how I improved it. So the first issue I tackle is the nav bar. The logo is way too much of an afterthought based on the original design. Not enough white space was placed above it, and it shouldn't be based on a fluid 100% width alignment. Also, they've broken a cardinal rule. Don't use a hamburger menu on desktop, especially if you only have 4 links. There's more than enough room width-wise to place those links, therefore reducing the amount of clicking a person has to access the navigation. Notice how nice, thick, and bold I've made the headline. It stands out so much more than the original design. The same can be said about the call to action button as well. You want both your headline and your call to action to be very obvious with high contrast. Now next, I decided to use an entirely different illustration. It's a more detailed and more interesting illustration which suits the hero section much more, rather than just placing an extra large icon. This is a free illustration and there are plenty of free illustration resources you can use, so check the YouTube description for the link. So I spend the rest of the time just customizing the color and also trying to create an additional illustration of something like a shooting star. This particular design isn't entirely too bad, but overall it just seems too bland and dark. So let's see what we can do to fix this. So I'm going to keep the overall layout here with the thumbnail in the background to the right with an overlay container on top. It can definitely work this way. Now, one thing I don't like is how they situated the project tags with the GitHub and website icons underneath. They should both be on the same row, but in 2 columns instead. Another thing are project thumbnails. You need to make sure you have great thumbnails to feature the project. Seldom will a design look good when you just screenshot it and slap it in. Give it perspective, show it in a mock-up, or do something interesting. I feel like this design is too dark, so I'm experimenting with different ways to give it more brightness. I ultimately end up featuring the main content card by giving it a brighter blue color. And here's where I fix those tags and also align the GitHub and website icons to the right in a second column. So here is the original, and then here is the final. For the second entry, we have a lot of issues with color and some issues with white space and alignment, so let's see what we can do to fix this one. So the biggest issue with this particular entry are the black card backgrounds, which really break up the flow of the layout, and also the 4 rows of content inside of the cards and how they're aligned with each other. One problem is the visual hierarchy between the 2 call to action buttons on the original design and the tags. The 2 buttons should be distinguished from each other, and the tags should be more of an afterthought as they're not actionable or clickable. When you have a lot of horizontal space, you should use it wisely, which is why I decided to right align the tags here with the 2 call to action buttons aligned to the left. This helps simplify the design as we now have 3 rows of content as opposed to 4 occurring one right after the other. Also, I decided to experiment here and break out of the box, so to speak, which is something you can do with low contrast backgrounds that have content that sits on top. For the final entry, we have a fair amount of issues here that range from colors, white space, visual hierarchy, and more. Now let's see if I can still capture the same feel while making improvements in all of these areas. So I'm getting started with the cards as they're the focus of this particular page. The thumbnails used here are not that great, so again, we need to make sure we use excellent thumbnails to feature our projects. Next up, listing the tags first in the manner this designer did does not really make sense. Notice how theirs has more contrast and larger size than the project description. You don't want that because the description here is more important than the technologies used. So I'm going to place the description first and then more of an afterthought, which is reinforced by less contrast, will be the actual project tags. Notice how just using really good solid white space all around results in such a bigger improvement. This is all fundamental stuff here. Now, one other adjustment I do make, I feel like there needs to be a little bit more contrast between the cards and the background, so I darken it just a few shades lighter. And also I decide to place the actual tags underneath, and really the difference is negligible. You could have left them, I could have left them inside either way. Here's the first contact form design, which suffers from a number of issues that can be remedied in a relatively easy fashion. First, I choose to left align the Contact Me title, as I'm not a big fan of starting the title on the second column. Next, I start working on a form, and the form has a couple major issues. It doesn't need the placeholder values. These types of form elements that are for name, email, and message are rather self-explanatory. Additionally, it's very cluttered because the placeholder text is quite dark, which competes for way too much attention against the label itself. Now, another thing I don't need is the subject input field. I don't feel a subject serves any significance on a contact form. Whatever needs stated can be addressed in the message box, and this also reduces friction. It's one less thing the user has to fill out. Next, I choose to place the additional content on the right column instead of making it on the left column. The form is the most important, therefore I feel it should be placed on the left. Finally, I use the same icon designs on this section, but I decide just to align them a little bit better. And then finally, I decide to add a colored column just to give the layout a little bit more structure. For this entry, it's lacking a few small things that can result in really big improvements. The first thing I decide to do is take that purple middle row and extend it to 100% of the design. It being cut off on the left and right just makes it feel incomplete. The next issue is there's not enough white space inside of the white container that contains the form content. One of the easiest ways to kill a design is a lack of white space. Additionally, the purple labels, which I'll assume are floating labels and not just placeholder values, are suffering from a lack of white space on the left. You want equal white space from the top, bottom, and the left. The purple text color doesn't work well either against the gray input field backgrounds, so I decided to make the backgrounds white and use a border around the text input fields instead. Their call to action button wasn't too bad, but the icon inside of them was too large, so I adjust this. Now, for the fun of it, I decide to prototype a floating label interaction. Remember, you don't want to use placeholder values in place of actual labels. At the very least, use a floating label and ensure it's still accessible. This next design suffers from a lot of design issues, so let's see if I can address them while still maintaining the same general layout and colors. I really feel that the top navbar color being slightly off color from their background doesn't really work well, so initially I keep it the same color as the background, which simplifies the design. Now next, they have major issues with color and white space inside of their form container. It's pretty much impossible to get medium gray to work well when it's sitting on top of a colored background. Eventually, I end up addressing this issue, but remember, when you try to mix colors, they really need to complement and contrast with each other. Next up, their social media icons. Being placed very strangely and not using identifiable logos really throws off the design. So I decided to use some predefined social media icons, but instead of just having 3 social media icons with no other context, I also add some other text-based content as well. Here's a submission that features a section that's commonly found beneath the hero section on a landing page, an about us section with a few features describing their business. Now, outside of some obvious UI design issues, it's pretty boring, so I'm gonna try and remedy that situation the most. So the first thing I want to do is to take the what we do text and stick that on a left column. Aligning it to the center all alone doesn't make any sense on a larger viewport. That's something that only makes sense when you don't have enough space. And as you can see here, I'm just experimenting with a unique way to feature the headline. Now for the areas where we have 5 different features with an associated icon, we can tackle this many different ways. I'm choosing to situate them in a right column, and within that column having 2 columns with 3 rows for each of the features. And it will fill up this single 50% width column on a larger viewport. I also choose to slightly change up the background color for each of the features, which will help distinguish the features in a subtle manner from each other. Finally, I decide to replicate the artboard so that I can experiment with a light color scheme, and then to make it a bit more unique, you will see in a bit that I decide to slightly rotate the features section, which I think makes it look really cool. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this particular refactor. Let me know what you think, if you agree or disagree, in the comments. Here's a skills and about me section that's lacking a lot of structure and white space. The 4 bits of information, such as being a Google Code-In winner and other accolades, are something that's worth emphasizing more. So I'm going to create a sort of slideshow or like a horizontal navigating UI where each of these sections has a dedicated screen. So I'm thinking about creating sort of a horizontal navigation for each of the 4 sections. This could be realized in many different ways during the front-end development process. If it were a slideshow, it could pause on one slide for a few seconds and transition to the next. If it were a horizontal scrolling page, it could transition to each section based on scroll. Now, it's just a matter of creating 2 columns where on the right, a relevant photograph could be placed, and on the left, more information about this specific page. Now, after this step, I prototype a very rough animation of what it could look like, but due to limitations of Adobe XD, the result is nowhere near as good as what it could be if it were fully realized in the browser, especially with something like Greensock Animation Platform. Here's another really common pattern for illustrating features of a given service, but I want to offer up a different full page approach for these 3 specific sections. So we have 3 sections, and being that I want this to be full screen, I want to partition the layout into 3 of these sections. Now you could go with 3 equally length columns, but you could also do what I'm doing, which is a 50% width single column on the left and then split the right column into 2 rows. Next up, I want to use photograph-based backgrounds that are somehow relevant based on the content that will sit on top. Now, for 2 of these sections, I use a photograph technique where the photograph seamlessly overlays into the background. In the third, I use a more traditional approach of using a photograph watermark background. So notice the amount of white space and just how much easier it is to read and follow. This particular example has potential as the icon designs are pretty nice and the contrast is decent, but the alignment of the type elements are all out of whack. So the biggest issue with this design is the alignment of the type that's situated in the left column. When you have this type of two-column layout, it almost never looks good when you center the text in the right or left column. You need to either left or right justify the text. Now, I also decide to make the call to action stand out a bit more by using a color found in the illustration. Now, there's a lot of ways to approach this type of layout, so I do another one just to show another common approach where you take a real large illustration and kind of situate it off to the very right edge or the very left edge of the browser. This one lacks two things in my opinion, typography and quite frankly it's just a bit bland. So here I start off by recreating the header and navigation. The navigation links are way too spread out over the original design, so I'm situating them closer together but also moving them over to the right to establish the very right edge of the layout's container. Now next up, I don't know about you, but that big A is rather boring. So I'm making a big watermark out of a capitalized A to give it texture, and then I'm going to situate a lowercase a on top of it. And then finally, the main type and the letter spacing is way too large. There's few instances in which such large letter spacing ever looks good in typography. So I'm going to be fixing that, as well as removing the borders and opting for a more modern approach of highlighting words and redoing a quick call to action. This next example has a number of issues that I'm simply going to revamp from the ground up with my own style of design. So when I think of restaurants and food, I think of awesome photographs that make you want to eat there. That's why having a professional photographer is so important in these cases, so that the designer has access to a variety of photos to choose from. Now here I'm opting for a two-column style layout, similar to the original. One problem with the original is that the blue border between the headline type, it just doesn't look good. So I'm opting to keep things a bit more simple there. I also think the little thumbnails for the different foods they offer were too small on the original. And I do change the large photograph in the right column because it wasn't contrasting well with the thumbnails. But for the rest of this design here, I'm simply experimenting with the layout positioning, and I do create a second variation of the layout. This is always important because by just experimenting with the positioning of various elements, you can stumble upon a layout option that really works well. This first entry is for a food app, and outside of it just being badly pixelated, there's some other issues with borders in white space. Now this is going to be mainly a UI revamp, not UX, because I just don't have enough info about what this app is about outside of it being related to food. So colors and overall layout, that's all going to remain the same, but I'm going to improve key areas mainly in relation to the cards and other finer details. Now the one thing that really kills this UI are the thick colorful borders that wrap around the card elements. All of those differently colored, thick lines add a lot of unnecessary clutter, and it adds to inconsistency to the design. I do keep a very light border around the top three cards, but it's very subtle and hardly noticeable, which is what I recommend when it comes to these types of borders. Also, the original layout lacked a lot of white space within the cards, mainly in relation to the labels under the Best for Breakfast section, so I'm adding more white space in that area. Now outside of that, for the most part, everything remains the same, and you can see that ultimately there will be a significant boost in the quality of the UI just by changing those few things. here is a personal portfolio for a software engineer. I think we can definitely improve the layout as it pertains to the character, the call to action buttons, and the about section. So first off, I think there's too much text designated for the headline. And there's really 3 parts of that headline. Hey there, I'm Callum, and then the rest of it. So I'm removing hey there because that's insinuated by the character waving and making I'm Callum a sub-headline in a smaller font. Now next, the position of the Illustrator character seems too displaced and may get cut off on smaller smartphones. So I think if we repositioned it to the right side of the screen in its own column and this headline to text to the left, it might be a better fit. Now next, I always advise to have a single primary call to action. If you have 2 calls to action, one needs to be styled differently. There should be a primary, and if need be, a secondary call to action. Now the secondary call to action in this case is CV, so it should be de-emphasized because it's less important. Now I also felt his about section was a bit weak in terms of type alignment, and a great way to modernize this type of section is to use watermarks. For the final entry, we have another portfolio, and I feel that the illustration just seems way too cheesy, and the 3 similar styled call to actions are just too confusing and lacks visual hierarchy. So the first problem I saw with this design was the 2 bits of type that are styled exactly the same. You really don't want to do this when it comes to headlines and subheadlines, as it throws off visual hierarchy and the user just isn't exactly sure where they should look and read first. Secondly, the illustration seemed way too weak and generic. Ideally, you would have a professional illustrator create a custom illustration for you, but if you can't do that, then you can use some of the many great resources for pre-made illustrations, which I'm doing here. Now, overlapping the headline on top of the illustration works in this context because the background of the illustration is like a watermark, which allows the type to shine on its own, but it also allows it to feel just and look more modern. Now, the 3 similar styled buttons are a big no, because there isn't a single button that really stands out as being the primary one that you want the user to click. So I'm fixing that by designating just one of the 3 as being primary and de-emphasizing the other one as just being a text-based link. Alright, so this is a layout for Union Coffee, which is a specialty coffee brewery, essentially. So we'll see what we can do to improve this. Alright, so here I'm using the same background photograph and largely specifying the same header with the logo and the 3-item navigation that's right aligned to the top. And then I decided I wanted a bit more of a dynamic layout that included more content above the fold, so I'm positioning the photograph in its own column to the right, and I also wanted to ensure the navigation is easy to read, so I placed a black background container behind the type. Now instead of a white background, I opt to use the background color that's found in the original design's layout, and also instead of just specifying the name of the business as the original design had as the primary headline, I'm taking a few words from the description and emphasizing that instead. Now next up, their About Us section lacked a lot of white space, so I'm resituating that and improving that area as well. Also, just to give a layout more character, you can add these watermark-based block columns in the background. And then finally, I stick with their same layout for the section at the bottom, with the alternating left and right layouts for our roast types and coffee and community, but I'm making sure that they have a lot more white space between themselves and the elements that are contained within. Alright, right, so next up is this personal design portfolio. We're definitely going to resituate this and also integrate a contact form in the actual page, which we'll get to. All right, so I'm not quite a fan of having such a large sidebar style menu when you only have 4 links, so I'm going a more conventional route with the top menu instead while still maintaining the same colors and such. Now, I'm keeping the interesting script headline to maintain the same character of the design, but I'm restructuring the layout here so that we can work in a contact form. If you have a portfolio, you need a contact form that's embedded on your site. Some people may be using devices that don't have an email client set up, and that could be a lost client, which could be worth thousands of dollars. You have to make sure you make it as easy as possible for people to reach you. Now, to make good use of the form while also providing people with an email and phone-based alternative means of contact, I'm using a 2-column layout. We've designated the contact form as the primary form because it has so much space and it's situated to the left, and the secondary means of contact are placed to the right. And finally, I experiment a bit more with the layout, but to add more character, I opt to just add a watermark based on the script type in the headline. All right, for this entry, basically a lot here is happening right. I like the illustration to the right, I like the colors, but we are going to work on the alignment and the type specifically, as we will see. Now, the first thing I do is resituate the logo, which contains a symbol, word mark, and a tagline. The original had bad alignment between these 3 elements, so I fixed that. Next up, I recreate the top navigation, which is pretty standard, though their highlighted link color doesn't contrast quite enough. Now, the main area that's wrong is the headline, subheadline, and call to action. They're right aligned too close to the illustration, and it really throws off the flow of the layout. Now, for the headline, there's quite a bit of text, so I opt to separate that text in terms of style to reinforce visual hierarchy. And while these aren't huge changes, you'll see in the before and after that these small changes do make a noticeable difference to the quality of the layout. All right, so our first entry here is from Discord user Srijad, and this is basically the middle of a landing page for a personal portfolio, and you can see there's cards here that list out skills that I think can definitely be improved. All right, so I'm using the same gray background color and placing the headline type. Sometimes it's nice to really fill out a page and give a character to use a watermark. In this case, it's the headline, but really enlarged and barely visible from the background. Now, to also introduce color in this grayscale setting, I'm adding a little border above the headline with a variety of colors. Now, I decided to not use actual cards here because there's 6 different items, and I just thought that was a bit much. I also noticed his use of icons were inconsistent. Some were filled, some weren't, so you want to keep that aesthetic of your icons consistent. Next, the actual skill listings I'm choosing to encase in a little container to really separate them and draw focus to them, in contrast to the rest of the type on page. Now also, I choose not to make them stand out too much with the blue background, and instead give them a slightly darker gray from the background of the page. There's plenty of potential ways to lay out the icon in relation to the skill title and the breadcrumbs, but I decided to align them in 2 columns to save vertical layout space. And next, this isn't necessary at all, but for some reason I felt compelled to add a few of the icons right aligned to the skills heading just to fill that area out a bit more. But honestly, I would probably opt just to omit those for now, and now that I think about it, that way it's a little bit more simplistic. So here's the before, and here is my version. All right, next up is from user Zishan, and there are white space issues along with alignment as well. So let's see how we can improve this. First up, the skewed background being the same color as the cards was just giving the design too much blue. So I thought of doing something a bit more unique and creating large pill shapes and skewing them along the same angle. Then, to really make sure the cards stick out more, I make them white. I also ensure there's really good white space inside of the cards, as well as making sure everything is consistently aligned, which was an issue with the original Designs cards. Now, next up, I really struggled with the pill shapes. I experimented with changing their colors, their positions, etc. They just didn't feel or look right to me. But ultimately, I did end up with something that I liked a lot more. It just took me some time. Now, I know I diverged quite a bit from the original design, but I just wasn't happy with everything being in the same blue hue. So I introduced more color in the form of pastels. So here's the original. And here is mine. All right, here's an entry from Discord user GMS Husem. And this is a PC parts picking landing page that I definitely think can be improved. Now, I found a similar background image from Unsplash, and I really try to make it a lot darker so that it has overall less contrast. That way the type elements on top of it can be seen and read more easily. The navigation was a little strange from the original as it lacked a logo, so I stuck to a more traditional approach. The original headline was too long to be styled the same, so I broke it into two parts and established visual hierarchy between them as a headline and a sub-headline. Also, the biggest issue in terms of UX here is the original layout lacked a clear call to action. This is a site to help you find PC parts, so why not add a prominent search field with a call to action that really stands out? So this first entry isn't terrible, but there are some issues with the navigation and just overall clutter with such a busy photograph being used as the entire background. So the first thing I do is use a different photograph because I wasn't able to use the original photograph as they baked in the overlay into the photograph itself. Now, instead of making the photograph consume the entire layout, I decided to go with a two-column approach with the important type behind the white background. Now, another thing you might notice, they have a red vertical marker to the left of their subheading, which lacks a lot of contrast based on the background. Now, their call to action buttons were a bit understated, and while they distinguish the two call to actions from each other in terms of design, I feel the most important call to action, which usually resides to the left, should be the one that has the solid fill. Their navigation suffers from two issues. First, the background is just too busy, so it's hard to see the secondary navigation that's right aligned. Now second, their primary and secondary navigation aren't styled differently enough from each other. The only difference is a slight separation of font size. So if you have a primary and secondary navigation like this, make sure you style them differently enough from each other. As you can see, I experimented with stylizing the photograph just to give it some character rather than just being a whole rectangle. I did also experiment with adding a scroll indicator icon, but I just didn't like how it was turning out, so I ended up removing it altogether. Plus, it's also just unnecessary in this context. Now this one has a nice color scheme, but there are issues with balance, white space, and typography, so let's see what we can do to improve this. The first issue that I'll address is the navigation. There's not enough white space around the entire nav bar itself, but there is too much white space between each individual nav item. So it makes the navigation field seem too loose and disconnected. You don't want them too close, but you also don't want them too far away. Next up, for some reason, there's way too little white space above the primary content section and way too much beneath it. This makes it hard to focus on the headline, plus it's just unbalanced. I also experiment with font choices and colors. Using two different typefaces for labels, headings, and subheadings can be a bit of a tricky process, so it's worth taking your time and experimenting. Notice how on the original design, his photograph has his left arm cut off. This doesn't look good, so I decided to enlarge it and right align it to the edge of the design, which makes it look much more natural. I do love the orange color, so I experiment with different shapes to ultimately come up with something that resembles the original design. For the final redesign, we have a card section of a layout. Now this one is significantly lacking in both contrast and also some typography issues. When you have three contextually different pieces of type that are relatively close to each other, you need to make sure that they're both A, styled differently from each other to achieve good typographic visual hierarchy, and B, they're still readable with a good contrast. I decided to create 3 different variations of the cards with different backgrounds. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but it's to show that you do have options. Now for the very first entry, we have some cards and a headline. Now there's some issues with the white space around the cards, and it's also just a little bland. Now in this context, I've never been a fan of center aligning the headline. I think it helps the overall structure of the layout to flow better when it's left aligned. I also think it makes most sense to stick with the sans serif font, as that's what's being used for the card type. Now I'm pretty much sticking with the same typographic setup that they have within the cards, but one thing that really just makes everything seem so monotone and boring is the lack of color and imagery. So I'm going to add a colored icon, which should really help the design. Now, one thing the original design lacked was the amount of white space between the cards. There's simply too much. There's such thing as too little and too much white space, of course, and it's important to develop an eye for making that determination. Now in this next design, we have a services section that suffers from a bit of clutter along with white space issues. Now the number one biggest issue with this layout is white space, or rather the lack thereof. When you have a bunch of type that's crammed together, it makes it difficult to read, and also it just makes the design look amateur. When you have paragraphs of type, give it space, especially in the context of a feature section like this. And finally, the services label, I decided to make a watermark. The fact that these are services offered is inferred by the content itself. So making it a watermark gives it some elegance and simplicity. And last but not least, we have some issues with color and alignment on this design. So let's see if we can give this a facelift. So starting out, the typographic visual hierarchy of the headline and subheadline is pretty solid, but it should be aligned vertically in the center based on the height of the three chat blips to the right of it. Now, one of the biggest things killing the original design was the gray background of the chat cards against the dark blue background of the page. Grays never go well with colors in this context, so I'm using the same hue, but simply making it lighter by adding tint. When you use this method, you generally can't go wrong. As far as the individual cards are concerned, I felt overall it lacked some white space, so I decided to slightly change up the layout, but also add that needed white space. Now, while this is okay looking and still an improvement, we can use graphic design to make things more interesting. So I'm adding a little dotted line going from one chat to the next, and I also decided to add a colored icon above the headline. Alrighty, here's a layout that has some inconsistencies in terms of alignment along with white space and color. So let's see what we can do to fix this one. First, the cards here are a bit problematic. The icons having a slightly different blue from the titles beneath them is inconsistent and throws off the design. I'm going to take a more monochromatic approach and just make them white. I also decided to omit a line of text that essentially said the same thing across all three cards, quote, total number of X. In my opinion, this is unnecessary, so I decided to discard them. The original design suffers from a lack of consistent alignment. Notice how the top three cards are in a smaller width container, and then the content beneath it is extended wider. But then the two columns for downloading items are moved in further with white space on the right and left. This uneven sort of alignment throws off the flow of a design. This design has potential as I like the colors and the general layout, but we could definitely make some improvements. The background idea they had was a cool way to add texture, but not using perfect circles was a mistake. And the colors they choose for the top two blobs didn't match well with the main background color. So I used the same hue, but just adjusted the saturation and lightness values to keep them consistent. As you can see here, I've decided to left align the form as it's the most important column. And as you can see, their "Let's Talk" text, which is nearly red, does not contrast well with the background, so I kept it white for now. Another thing to know are their text field elements. You should never only use an underline for a text field. Studies have confirmed that this confuses some users as they think it's a line break. Also, my labels are meant to be floating labels in case you're curious, not actual placeholder values. This final entry has some issues with typography and scale, so let's see what we can do to make this one better. Right off the bat, I did not like how the column on the left had such little width. This feels way too crammed, so I decided for a more open-ended approach and not contain the left column in a visible column with a different background color. Also, to give your design texture, you can always add illustration-based watermarks behind your text as long as they're a very low contrast. To create a sort of story and direct the eye, I designed a dotted line with an arrow that leads from one point of emphasis to the other. We're looking at the footer here for this first entry, and there's a number of things primarily related to alignment and structure that we're going to address here. Now, the first order of business is to recreate the two-column structure above the footer to give it some context, and largely I'm just going to keep it the same. The first thing that I dislike is center aligning the logo in the footer. This should be left aligned in order to reinforce the left column that's been established by the title and paragraph above it. Next up is the navigation. Now, I dislike placing the nav items vertically. I think it makes most sense to create a horizontal navigation and then, which you'll see shortly, add secondary links underneath each of the relevant nav items. This gives you the ability to then place links to less important pages that you couldn't find or place otherwise in the top navigation. finally, I decided to place the social links underneath the contact section, because after all, the social links do provide yet another form of contact. Oh, and yes, I am just screenshotting their raster-based icons just for this demo, just because I did want to use the same exact icons. This next entry is a contact form. Now there's a number of issues here that we're going to address right this second. So the very first thing I want to talk about is form width. Notice how long their form elements are. You want to avoid that. That's why I'm going to place this particular design into a 2-column layout with the form on the left and the secondary information on the right. Another huge issue is the lack of white space between the form elements. Squashing them up like that makes using the form difficult for people, so you want to ensure that you have a good amount of white space between your form elements. I don't really like the look of the black type on the blue button background, so to ensure I have good contrast, I'm going to use the white text on top of a darker blue background in a second. Also, notice how they've encased their email address into a similar shape as their submit button. That is very confusing to users and also makes the design look way too blocky. This final entry suffers from complexity issues. There's just too much happening here that we could greatly simplify. So as a bonus, I will design 2 different layouts that could work for this design. The big problem here is using the photograph as a full background with the transparent content container on top. It makes for a layout that's just too cluttered. So in this initial layout, I'm going to create 2 columns with the photograph in the right column. Their very large button with a lot of type in it doesn't make sense. Users might not know it's an actual clickable button, so I'm simplifying the text inside of it. For this second version of the layout, you'll see me hop inside of Photoshop to do some editing of the photo and create another variation of the layout that would work just fine. Now that's the end of my commentary for this video, so if you enjoy these videos, let me know in the comments section and I'll keep producing them. Alright everybody, I'll see you all later. Alright everybody, hopefully you enjoyed that. Make sure to check out DesignCourse.com if you really want to learn UI, UX in an interactive setting. Also, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.